Hello, beautiful people. I'm Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, and in this clip, I will be speaking with Jared of The Great Order. You can find him online at thegreatorder.com, as well as on YouTube under the same name, The Great Order. He's also co-host over at the channel No White Guilt. I recently did an interview with him, and the host over there, I really enjoyed it, so have a look at that as well. I'll post links in the description box below. Please check him out and check out No White Guilt. Now, in just a moment, I will give Jared a chance to introduce himself. But before doing so, I want to set the stage for our discussion. We're here today because Jared is open to talking about individualism without rejecting it straight out of the gate. Though it seems to me that he does want to balance that, very much wants to balance that against what he sees as the cultural demands or responsibilities that come with it, or that might even trump it, particularly the need to preserve, protect, and promote the peoples of the West. So, I mean, this is just my impression. He will obviously be speaking for himself, but we've gotten together now to talk about the pros and cons of individualism versus the demonstrable usefulness of cooperation in a productive way, in what might even be a necessary way, given what's been going on in the world. So the topic of our discussion is balancing the many and the few. Now, Jared, before we get into it, I wonder if you can tell our viewers more about yourself, where you're coming from, what you seek to achieve, and how you got involved in all of this in the first place. What's your story? What have you set out to do? And how did you get started with all this? Was there a tipping point?
Sure, Oliver. Well, of course, thank you for having me. It's great to be on your channel, Semiagog. We did have a wonderful conversation with you over on No White Guilt's channel with my friend and partner, Jason, over there. His channel, No White Guilt. We host a live stream typically on Wednesdays called the After Party, and you were our guest a couple of weeks ago. It was fantastic, and we knew there was just so much we want to keep talking about, and I look forward to collaborating with you. It's been great just communicating with you, and I've been a fan of your channel for some months now, so just expressing my gratitude, and thanks again for that introduction.
Oh, yeah, thanks for having me over there. Sure.
Yeah, it's great, and here's to a lot of this. So, generally speaking, just to give a little bit of an introduction, I guess a theme in my life, it's funny we're talking about balance, I can't get away from that, has been weaving together these two experiences that I have of myself, or way of looking at the world, that I guess on the one hand is order and on the other hand is openness. So on the one hand, with order, I had something of a enjoyed, I should say, because I feel very blessed in this way, something of a traditional upbringing, and even from a young age had a pretty strong sense of morality and standards and traditions. Yet at the same time, I was schooled and reared in big cities. I came across many different types of people from all walks of life. Mostly those interactions have been very positive, I should say. I have a bit of a creative temperament, so there's certainly a natural openness that I believe comes with that personality as well. And what else could I say? There's something in me, I guess you could say, that wasn't tribalistic, which might be funny because I'm now in a space, I'm generally in the space that is thought to be nationalist or identitarian. But I remember being 8, 9 years old, standing in my childhood bedroom alone and reasoning to myself that had I been born in another city, I would be expected to root for another baseball team. I mean, when you're 8 or 9 years old and you're already having thoughts like that on your own, I think the die is already kind of cast. So there have been, as I said, these two strands weaving together of order and openness, and I'm hoping that, everyone plays their role, everyone has their different experiences, their different strengths and weaknesses. I have been watching some of this conversation unfold for the last few years, and I'm hoping to add this balanced perspective to it. In terms of antecedents to how I got here, I think I've always had a sense of my European roots in some regard, maybe not as articulated or as developed when I was younger as now, but I can think to all kinds of things that were even instinctual when I was a kid, look back on certain things, connect dots now to see that it was always there, but it certainly grew in past years. It initially was not in response to anything crazy going on. I got more interested in it a few years ago, but it was still before the migrant crisis. And some of the things that we see now that are more blatant, these crazy news stories, attacks on whiteness, it's not a response to that. I was on this trail some years before that, to tell you the truth. Some of it had to do with, I think, something that was more instinctual again, not necessarily political. It was more, I see politics as the outward mechanics, or the outworkings of things that are more biological, emotional, you could even say perhaps spiritual. And I was looking at material that talked about European conceptions of deity and folklore. And I was reading a site that was not necessarily this kind of lefty neo-pagan type thing. It wasn't that. But I still had this sense that I wanted something more. There was just that tantalizing feeling I think you have when you're a seeker, that you just know there's something else out there. You don't quite know what it is. And even though you can definitely point out to some negative side effects of this digital age that we live in, I do think one of the more interesting things about it is that serendipity of web surfing. And I can't tell you how it happened, but I ended up on the site countercurrents.com, counter-currents.com, Greg Johnson's site. And I think I landed on an article by Colin Cleary, who writes a lot about Germanic and Norse paganism. But again, writes about it not in this LARPy way at all, but more explaining this holistic view of life that certain European peoples had and what that did to their consciousness, you could say. And I knew that I had landed somewhere that was interesting. It was what I was looking for. And then just so many things blossomed from there, discovering kind of what was kind of this forgotten intellectual history that you're not taught about in school. And it was fascinating, and there was, a bit of the thrill of the taboo there. But that was still, as I said, a few years before the migrant crisis, so that by the time the migrant crisis hit, because you did ask about before and after moments, I wouldn't say that it was before and after moment, but I would point to it as the moment that if I had to say there was one piece of news where I was not the same after it, even though it had been happening, it was really ramped up, and it hit me in the media in the fall of 2015, going on 3 years ago at this point, the time of this recording. All of the stuff that I just mentioned, I guess, gave me the backstory to know what was going on and put it in more context. I think it would have freaked me out even if I hadn't read all of that material in the years prior. I think there was still something instinctual and in my DNA that would have been like, this is not quite right. This is a Trojan horse. This is not the happy, smiley faces refugees welcome that the media was trying to present. But it was still a turning point, you could say, or the straw that broke the camel's back. And then I knew that I needed to get into this. So I started my website and channel relatively recently. I'm still under a year old. It was in the fall of 2017. I did some videos, but I guess my kind of coming out was being on Millennial Woes' Millennial. That was a nice platform to be on in December. After that, I met Jason of No White Guilt, and we started doing streams in February, which has been amazing. We get to talk to many interesting people from around the world. And I continue to make my own videos. On my site, I have some original poetry, curated art, some t-shirts, some resources. So it's just been, my vision is just to keep going and meeting new people and doing more creative work along with the editorial work, and just really be part of something that is healthy and proactive, not just talking about graphs and charts and crime stats. Yes, that has a place, but I think it's high time that people who are advocating for this kind of thing talk more proactively about who Europeans are, who we are. Yes, I know that's a broad term. There's ethnicities within that. I'm all into addressing both of those layers. The more ethnic, like, oh, I'm Swedish or oh, I'm German, and then the more overarching Western European civilization or race. There's a place for both of that. There's no reason for them to contradict each other. But we need, on both of those levels, people to get back in touch with who they are and advocate for who they are, And to me, this comes along with that holistic view of life that I was just indicating. The order in my project's name, I like to say, is not the order of the greenhouse, it's the order of a forest. So you still understand that there's still some apparent messiness that comes along with that, even though there's an order, which I think is what we're about to get into.
Quite. One of the reasons I'm happy to be speaking with you, where I feel like there's some room, right, where our Venn diagrams overlap productively, is that idea of yours about the nested layers of identity. The way it got taught to me was, individual, and then familial, and then, clan, if you will, extended family, then ethnic, and then on up the ladder, as it were. So you see that there are, in fact, multiple levels of identity, and that is certainly something that I don't reject with some kind of, absolute atomized individualism. So yeah, there's a lot of room to cover the different perspectives here, the collective and individual, the many and the few, if you will. So let's just jump right in. I heard you talk about, when we were discussing this, pitching, ideas back and forth to get our conversation into a box with four walls and a ceiling and a floor, so that we have, knowledge of what we're going to talk about. You had mentioned your desire to bring about healthier societies in the West, about your hope that we can find a way to ensure, I guess, a kind of cultural continuity and to enforce the cultural standards that you feel are important, while at the same time, as you put it, working to protect the outliers. You've also mentioned the need to identify ways to do this that don't become unnecessarily vitriolic or hateful, counterproductive. It's kind of like what you were just talking about with being for something, not just being against something. So can you tell us more about your thinking as regards this particular balancing act, the concern for collective and for collectives and the individuals it comprises?
Yeah, excuse me. There's a lot of different places that we can certainly go with that. Far be it from me to know, I'm not sitting here saying that I have this prescription for the perfect society. That would obviously be ridiculous.
Not yet, anyway.
So please, anyone listening, don't think that I think that highly of myself. But that's not to say that it's not worth having that conversation. That conversation may take place among and between many, many, many people over many, many, many years to come. But we need to start thinking in that way again, at least be asking those questions. One is that, as I was mentioning, getting back in touch with what it means to be, I'm just going to use the general term of European right now. We know being European is not a monolithic thing. We know Latvians and Scottish are not the same. But just to talk about the overall category right now of European, is I want to help enable people to understand that even if you're talking about the most peaceful, high IQ, productive, pristine individuals from other cultures, because this is where sometimes it gets into the weeds. Again, not that there's not important material here or information here, but I want to ennoble people where even if someone comes at you and says, we're bringing in the most high IQ, beautiful people from these other cultures, that you still have the moral center, you still have that center of gravity to say, no, too much of that is going to change the nature of our culture because our cultures are different. And this is one of the biggest taboos of the day and age that we live in, this idea of essentialism. That's not to say that there are not overlaps between this culture and that culture, of course, or even if when we look at genetics, everything has an overlap. We all know the old saying that, there's overlap in the color scale, in the old Roy G. Biv that we all learned in elementary school. Just because there's overlap between colors doesn't mean that there's not an actual category of red versus purple versus blue, etc. So that is an element to it. In terms of defining what it actually is to be European, one element, and this dovetails perfectly with the very conversation that we're having, is to look at our particular brand of how we balance the individual and the collective. Now, there's a gentleman who has articulated this beautifully, and I recommend people, if they really want to get into this, getting into his work, and that would be Ricardo Duchesne. This is Faustian Men in a Multicultural Age. This is a shorter book to start with and a little more digestible than the more academic uniqueness of Western civilization. But both of these works have figured a lot into what I'm doing. I'm glad to see that he's been more active. This guy needs to talk to Jordan Peterson. I know that he has critiqued Peterson and written some essays about him, but I really want to see Peterson put in a room with this guy and challenged in this way. He quotes, I believe it's Charles Murray in these books, saying that the Western man has a particular blend of purpose and autonomy. It's a particular way that we blend these things. And what I like about Duchesne's work is that he does not focus on just one turning point in history or one era of history. He will criticize historians who do this. Now, certain historians need a specialty to go very deep into a certain aspect of knowledge, a certain era in history. But what he criticizes is weaponizing that and using that, only focusing on this one little era to try to extrapolate that and say that that's the whole story or that this era reveals some pathology about the West. He says that no matter what, there's a nature that it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Roman Empire or you're talking about the Catholic Church or you're talking about the Germanic tribes. What I really feel is important about Duchesne's work is that he is looking at this spirit that I guess you could say is under all that or in us, or maybe floating above all of those details as well. And that there are certain instincts or a way of being that get expressed through these things. So it's not that it's just the Catholic Church and things that they did that affected our culture. It's not just the Roman Empire. And what he does is he goes back to the old Indo-Europeans or Aryans, and he speaks about how even in ancient Greek times, not to say that there weren't leaders, not to say that there wasn't corruption among leaders, that's always going to happen, of course, but there's antecedents to things that we even see today in the United States. There are councils of farmers who would come and vote on things. Or in the Middle Ages, feudalism, would it be barbaric by today's standards? Probably so if we were transported back in time, but still compared to other forms of feudalism, he points out things like there were laws where a serf could enact certain legal structures and contracts to leave a landlord that treated him badly. In the Near East and in the Far East, you don't see things like this. It's more unilateral deference to the leader. In the West, you see more of these bands of elites at the top, and the leader, the king, is more of a first among equals. You think of things like the Knights of the Round Table. That would be one of kind of a mythopoetic example. But when you think of strands in our culture, in our heritage, you could say in our blood, like that, it makes sense. You can draw it to the modern United States, even for all of its problems. We still have this tradition of we're proud, free men, hands off our guns. We have separation of powers in our government. These things do not come out of nowhere. And I'm not saying I'm any kind of an expert, but it's certainly been humbling and it's been edifying and enlightening to begin to piece these things together and learn from people like Duchesne, who are, I like to say, giving us back to ourselves, because this has been obfuscated. There's been an attempt to take away Western civilization classes in schools. So it makes sense that our kids don't know who they are, that they're told that they're uniquely evil, they have some original sin of being white, of being European, and we see the havoc that is ensuing.
So when you talk about your interest in forming a healthier society, just to kind of connect, your thoughts there, you shared about your experience of Duchesne, whom I've not read, but you mentioned him in our previous discussion, so it's on my list now. Just to help us kind of connect the dots, though, can you describe any sort of lessons or things that you've learned from him that you think could be applied to sorting out the current mess that we are enjoying in the West? Because, what you mentioned, it sounds like there are a certain number of things that just come through naturally. And I like that you pointed out it could be above as well as below, right? You could say that there are these subconscious, collective, unconscious kind of aspects, but you could just as easily, as an explanatory tool, hypothesize a supra consciousness. That so you don't necessarily have to establish a hierarchy where the part that is shared is lower or the part that is shared is higher. In Christianity, we would all be wrapped up in the Christ consciousness as a part of the body of Christ, as a part of the church of all the believers who are redeemed through his primal act, right? So that's kind of collectivism that's above us. We could say that, from the perspective of the drooling, dribbling social justice warriors of today, that any attempt to see a basic foundation that we all share as Hawaiites is a sub thing, a thing that must be grown past, a thing that we must, free ourselves from. That I take this sort of individualistic perspective, but I certainly don't see my heritage that I share with any number of other people who come from European backgrounds. Actually, quite a large number, given that I'm such a mutt. I can draw on so many strands. I think we touched on it in the discussion over at No White Guilt. America is one of these rare places where you really can say that white does, with many caveats and provisos, but white does mean something here, simply because we've become such mutts in terms of the different Europeans coming together. In many instances, there are, of course, plenty of, straight bloodlines as well. But, given that there's this thing that we share, and in terms of heritage and background and the different structures that have been developed, structures, if you will, of our culture, and we don't have to position them as something that's beneath us, that's a foundation that must be grown past. I mean, how does the top of the Empire State Building, how could the top of a giant skyscraper be considered as having moved past its foundation? If its foundation is gone, the whole bitch falls like the Tower of Babel. So, having looked at Duchesne, are there any lessons that you've been chewing on from that source that you think can be applied to bring us back around to the idea of how we can find some way to make this society more healthy?
Yeah, not only more healthy, but again, healthy in our particular way as Europeans, as Westerners. I do, and it's something I believe you've spoken about, and I think we came to this independently. One would be mandatory national service. Going back to, again, those bands of warrior men, understanding hierarchy, understanding a chain of command and taking orders and everyone playing their role. Now, that's not to say that every 18-year-old, let's say it was something between high school and college, a mandatory year of service. Of course, I'm implying military. There could be other iterations of it. There could be something that's more volunteering, doing physical work, cleaning up parks or building things. But let's say that it would still have some kind of military order kind of feel to it, even if you weren't per se in the military. It'd still be kind of like this extended Boy Scouts or something. And I know you've done videos on the whole Boy Scouts thing. I enjoyed that presentation. You mentioned the SJWs. I think a lot of the trouble we get into is people have been so divorced from real life experience and real life relationships that they have the luxury of creating these abstractions. So they might sit around in their dorm room or sit around in Starbucks and come up with ideas that sound better than what we have now. But they can only do that because they haven't had to, the rubber hasn't met the road. They haven't had to live these experiences of completing a project or being part of a group of people where you are all responsible for each other. And if someone slacks, you can all get seriously hurt. Those kinds of experiences, giving that to young people, that's just one example. But that's the kind of thing that creates more personal responsibility and a sense of you are part of something bigger than yourself. Those two things, personal responsibility and feeling that you are part of something bigger than yourself, and the awe and the humility and the sense of wanting to contribute to that it elicits from you, are sorely lacking, and things that I think that we obviously need to get back to. There's also considerations, and of course, what I just said certainly I think has some overlap with this, of the family. Now, we are not clannish the way that certain other cultures are. Like in the Mideast, it is, from what I understand, more of a second and third cousin mafia. Like everything is, you give your job to, you can only really trust the people that you're related to. And Greg Johnson was talking about this story where it's the woman from, I don't know, she's Somali. I forget the author's name. The woman who I think left Islam, and she's kind of a big name, but her name is escaping me. Talks about it, how in Somalia, when two people meet, they have to rehearse their whole ancestry, and then they kind of figure out if they fight or if they're going to be friends, friend or foe. We, for a variety of factors, that's not Western civilization. That's not how we function. We're able to create higher trust societies and extend that trust outside of our immediate clan. But I would argue that there's still limits to that. And what we're seeing now, of course, I'm certainly not the first person to say this, is the degradation of a lot of Western European nations is because we're taking that instinct that helped us extend our idea of nation, not just to our second and third cousins, and have these large scale societal projects. And we're blurring the lines, not understanding that people from other cultures, because we've been brainwashed again about this idea of essentialism, not understanding that they're different than us, that they see us as rubes and they're taking advantage of us, and they are hollowing out our resources and our way of life, and sometimes in very real ways attacking or harming our people. This is an instinct that served us, but this is why I'm so big on understanding boundaries and spheres, and where sometimes something works in a certain context, but then it bleeds over into another context and becomes dangerous. And this is a prime example of that. So being able to understand ourselves vis-a-vis what I just said, how those instincts worked for us, but like it or not, you kind of had to keep a homogenous culture. Because again, to go back to the instincts thing and the Duchesne things flowing under or above the surface, I still think that things like, yes, economies and laws are very, very important. A lot of things flow downstream from what's codified in law or how an economic system is set up. But it's still the people and their instincts that bring it to life. So socialism in Scandinavia obviously is not the same thing as socialism in Latin America. And there's a reason for that. So I know we both have our criticisms of socialism, but maybe if Norway or Sweden never opened its borders, it would have worked for them. But they were duped with this whole guilt thing, and they have to open up and they owe people. So those are a couple of examples, what I just said about the military service, about understanding family, about understanding our wider societal cohesion, but that when you extend it to the whole world, it collapses. Those kinds of lessons, understanding more about our history, how we got this way, how it worked for us in the past, how it's harming us now. Just being able to have these conversations without fear of, looking over your shoulder and, oh, is anybody listening? Just freeing people to think this way, I think will go a long way. We're going to come up with new ideas, and we're going to get back in touch with our instincts, and we're going to get back in touch with advocating for ourselves as ourselves.
I can definitely hear that. For my part, I still struggle with this notion of something greater than myself. And that's not just rank egotism. I mean, I think a great deal of it simply comes from not having offspring at that point. Like, your mention of the phrase, when the rubber meets the road. Well, if you're a parent and you have not decided that the survival of your child is more important than you are, then clearly some shit is not screwed together right. But outside of that context, I generally politely excuse myself when there's too much talk of, what's greater than myself. Simply because I feel like each one of us, it's a fundamental thing about the West to be able to say, not in my backyard, fuck no. And that presupposes the idea that you yourself have a backyard over which you exercise dominion. And that is another, fundamental thing, whether we go back to, our Constitution here, whether we go back to Magna Carta, whether we go back to Roman law and the 12 tables. We've been developing for quite some time this continuously complexifying and maybe not evolving, but at least developing. I like at the best of times to think evolving notion of the individual person and the idea that they are unique, or at least potentially so, unto themselves, and that uniqueness should be fostered because it's the strange ones who have the more eccentric orbits, who get out there like a Newton or a Pascal or a lens grinder like what's his name in Holland, and he's the philosopher, and I should know. Christ, it'll come back to me. But the point is that we have built into our culture this idea that there's more room for individual difference. And I think I want to ask you about how, if you think it's necessary, and if so, how we can attempt to try to protect the individualistic aspects, which I think are unique to Western culture. I feel like that is the core of what makes us so powerful. Now, like all things, you talked about the way in which our perspectives have been exploited with malice or forethought. For my part, I feel like it's mainly fucking commies of whatever stripe. But, there's another thing that purely comes out of Western culture, which is the idea that the strength is the weakness. The sin of pride, it develops. That's a bad example. Let me think of a really good, solid one. Fortitude is one of the cardinal virtues. And so the idea that you should be ready to stand up against oppression and that you should be able to fight and work hard and have endurance to change the world the way it needs to be changed, that can twist the seed of that virtue is also the seed of the vice of being aggressive and overbearing and tyrannical. The virtue and the vice exist on a continuum, and that's why things like the Greeks, they say all things in moderation, including moderation. Well, we have this idea of individuality and how important it is, and yet we've seen how it can be exploited. And you see a lot of people on the alt-right going, yeah, it's atomization, this individualism that's really just egocentrism, and it's just to divide us up and make us all fight one another. I think it's inherent in it, but I don't feel like that's the true nature of the individuality I'm interested in. Now, you had asked when we were going back and forth, you'd heard me mention that I consider myself an elitist. And it may be useful at this point for me to describe what I mean about that.
I'd love to hear that.
And then that perhaps would set the stage perhaps for talking about what you called, the idea of self-sufficiency. But pairing that with the idea that no man is an island, and there's certainly truth in that. So maybe it'll help set the stage. In any case, it should help us to tease out where we're in alignment and where we're not. But what I'm mostly interested in, once I run this by you, is to hear you tell me whether or not there are things that you or others are thinking about in terms of how to protect the kind of things that I'm going to mention here, which are, the household gods that are on the altar here in my home, metaphorically speaking. So when I say I'm an elitist, I'm not talking about a social attitude. I am talking about a social attitude, not a political one, or at least not exactly. I'm not saying that a special elite group should be in charge of things in the way that, elitism is often generally understood. I'm saying that socially, we should be focused on personal realization and achievement, and that there's no place for participation trophies or any of the other egalitarian social justice bullshit other than strict equality under the law for all citizens. I say my elitism is not exactly political, because while this attitude does have all sorts of political implications, it doesn't strictly require any changes to the basic system we have in the U.S. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to change how we govern ourselves at this point. I'm not an elitist in the sense that I'm pushing for some new political system. It's more about all of us recognizing that embracing American political ideals, that protecting what I see as our nation's fundamental individualist ideals, independence rather than dependence, self-made men, self-made women, people who mind their own business and expect the same. That thing I just mentioned about, not in my backyard. That recognizing and endorsing and promoting this puts one in what I see as an elite category. It makes one an American, given that the American cultural product is individuals, as I see it. The focus is squarely upon creating more formidable individual persons, which is to say that the self-aware pursuit of individuation is, for me anyway, the elitist criterion. So any interest I might have in collectives is always going to be secondary and contingent, because I can deal with individual people, but in no way can I deal with the collective. That's why we choose spokesmen. That's why we have to elect representatives. It's not possible to negotiate with the crowd, only with the crowd's representative, which shows us how the whole idea of collective breaks down, illustrating how all collectives are what I see as reified abstractions. Collectives are what we get when we assign, I mean, for most people they are anyway. It's what happens when you assign a collective noun to a group of people. And then because there's a word for it, we assume that it's just as real and just as much of a unit as an individual person. But no collective has ever been as real as an individual person. Collective designators are simply useful fictions. Now, when I say fictions, note that I did qualify by saying useful, but they're always only more or less true, and therefore only more or less useful. So yeah, we can say that there's a group called Trump voters, and this is somewhat true, in that all the members of this group voted for Trump. But as soon as we try to establish other shared characteristics, it all starts to splinter and break down. Even if you carry with you that sort of, nested layers of identity you're talking about, the chart gets rather odd trying to bring all the pieces together and still see it as a coherent whole that's useful for reckoning. So that point at which the point at which the generalizations cease to become useful is the point at which we have to be ready to suspend those generalizations. And that point is precisely the point at which we recognize the individual, or at least that I recognize it, and I should say potential individual, because it's not always there. But anyway, it's the point at which we recognize exceptions. So when I talk about it, elitism, this is what I'm talking about. Exceptions are the focus of my elitism. For me, exceptions are what matter in life. Even more so, the exceptional is what matters. So I'm looking for the exceptional. I seek to experience the exceptional when I'm able. And to be exceptional, to whatever extent this is possible for me, is a goal. So I guess the many is always about normative standards, about what's ordinary, what's commonplace. And from what I've seen in my life, for the collectivist, the exceptional is at best an irritation, a thistle in their underwear, or at worst an indictment of their own mediocrity. The way in which collectivists go on about what's held in common suggests to me very often that they're quite literally commoners. I guess to wrap, collectives draw strength from what they hold in common. They're willing to be designated and addressed in common. They're willing to have their needs administered in common, to find their purpose in common. And commonly, I guess I can say, they come full circle to nothing, which is hardly surprising given that nothing is where they started out with their worship of reified abstractions that have nothing but a contingent reality as I see it. So for me, individualism is, in a fundamental sense, exceptionalism. And this exceptionalism is what I'm referencing when I say I'm an elitist. For me, it's always about the few. It necessitates a willingness to make exceptions, to a willingness to encourage the creation of exceptional things and people. It's like if you have, that you're going to have to go through any number of oyster shells if you want to find a pearl. So, you're going to have to heap them up in great piles. And obviously you don't get pearls unless they're oyster shells. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to be focused on these great teetering heaps of stinking old oyster shells. My focus is on the pearl of great price that comes out of them. And I think both in terms of my own personal life and in terms of the broader culture around me, I get that everybody has to be taken care of to some extent if you want social upheaval. But my focus is always on the pearl. And I guess that's That's my elitism.
I'd love to take everything you just said and address all the every sentence, and I'm sure we could have a whole show just on that.
It'd be torture for you to put you through that, but it's just kind of the
No,
general.
it would actually be my pleasure. By and large, I agree with the spirit of everything that you just expressed, and I myself live in that way. I would say to you, I look for the symbiotic relationship between the exceptions and the meaty middle part of the bell curve. And I would just put this back at you in considering how we need that baseline of the majority of people from which the exceptions will spring. Now, again, I know we're speaking a little categorically right now, and hopefully we'll be able to reel it back into what this particularly has to do with European civilization in the West. But just speaking generally, the kind of, you're talking about a certain orientation towards life, and maybe there were more individuals like this back in the frontier days of the United States. And maybe there are things that we can do to see more individuals like that appear again and stimulate that kind of personality. I would still say that I'm oriented similarly to how you are, but I've put my personal proclivity aside, and I've tried to not, because I did this when I was younger, and I think that there is a certain propensity for people who are very creative to be like this, and I certainly caught myself doing this, where you recognize to be creative, you have certain skills or traits that the majority of people don't have. And even if you're a mediocre artist, there's still something in the personality, even if you don't make it as an artist and you still have to have a day job, there's still something in the personality of an artist, of a writer, what have you, that requires observing, stepping back from society, stepping back at a party or a function and observing the dynamics, observing what's going on. Not everyone is built that way. Not everyone can be built that way. I don't think society would work if they were. So the challenge I give to you is just, is it wise for people like us to project ourselves, our particular personality makeup, onto everyone else and expect that that is how society is going to function? I would say that from the little I know, it might not be too much of a jump to say that if you and I met in real life and we developed something of a friendship and we traveled around to some other countries, just by the nature of who we are, how we speak, how we conduct ourselves, we would attract other people, wherever we go, whatever city we end up in, who play similar roles that we play in our society. You and I, Oliver, we would meet the outliers who are like us, who are more the priest archetype or the creative artist archetype, who take a step back, read the signs and symbols, articulate things for people in ways that are important for them, but they don't have the propensity to do themselves. We would meet those other exceptions. We would meet those other outliers who are wired like we do, because I do believe to a certain extent like attracts like. And we might even be tempted to say, wouldn't it be great if all the world were like us? Free thinking, open, artistic, creative people who can mix and match different things and aren't beholden to just, dogma. That might be great for us making friends. That might be great for us finding other people like us who, again, will share ideas with and inspire each other and learn things from. But my question is, are we conflating that kind of friendship or partnership, comparing notes with the other guys who play the similar role in their society as we do? Are we in danger of conflating that with projecting that onto how society as a whole should run? Are we in danger of projecting the way that some of the people we're critical of project? We criticize, you and I both, I'm sure, criticize the typical leftists or commies, as you say, who project all day? Are we not, people of our ilk, not capable of that kind of projection in this own way? I tried to take a step outside of myself. I think that you and I, from what I could tell, are very similar in this sense. And I resonate very much so with the spirit of what you said. And I'll refer again to how I opened and remind you, when I was 9 years old, I said if I was born in another city, I'd have to support another baseball team, kind of reason myself out of being a sports fan. I'm not tribalist by nature either. But I was able to combine that and also step outside of myself to a certain degree with my heritage, find sustenance in that, find meaning in that. Not that I was lacking meaning in my life prior to this, but it added to it, and it buoyed me. It's nourishing in ways that you can't even, I think, know why. Just like we don't need to understand the science of nutrition to benefit from eating good food. You can eat food and not know a thing about nutrition. There are things about connecting with your family, with your heritage, with where you come from. There's information packed into symbols, fairy tales, folk tales, in our case, different European symbols, architecture, that are just soul nourishing when we look at them, that I think speak to us on a level and shore us up on a level that is a little bit different than when we dip a toe in other cultures. So it might be fascinating to learn about other Eastern philosophies or go hang out in a pagoda, but it might not have the same kind of soul DNA stirring experience of when you're in the land of your ancestors, of where many of your grandfathers are buried. And again, among symbols, architecture, even the ecology, the particular kinds of trees and terrain that your ancestors have trod on for generation upon generation. So I'm getting off a little bit something different with those last few sentences, but the main thing that I'm getting back to is just being wary of projection and understanding that we might be outliers. You and I might get along better with outliers from Japan or India or Africa than certain people that we're more genetically related to. I have no problem admitting that, even though I'm an outspoken member of, again, these generally identitarian, nationalist, whatever dissident right circles you want to say. But just because I can recognize that this guy, he plays a similar role for his people, and we can be friends, and we can compare notes, and we can learn from each other, that doesn't mean that when I go back and I hang out with 100 million other people like me in a European civilization, that doesn't mean that I forget that there's something to all of us. I'm thinking about the body politic. I'm thinking about the symbiosis. I'm thinking about the fact that, yeah, even if there are lower IQ people in my that are more genetically related to me that I might not be the best of friends with, that we are still, they're still reading their kids the same bedtime stories at night. They still are moved, even if they can't express it the same way, by the same music or the same architecture, or feel just at a visceral level, we're part of the same thing. And if enough people from another culture or another ethnicity come in, it doesn't matter if they're the most peaceful, beautiful Tibetan Buddhists. If Europe was being flooded with Tibetan Buddhists right now, I would still be pissed off, because it's going to change the nature, the continuity of the story of who we are. And there's something sacred to that to me.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I noted your point about the projection. That's kind of how I threw the question at you. But do be aware, I've had it pounded into my skull by experience that the few are never going to be the many. The many are always going to be the many, and the few are always going to be the few. And what's most educational about the experiences that I've had living abroad and traveling quite a bit, is that the many are so much more many abroad, and the few are so much fewer. And so that's the part at which, I decided, fuck this, maybe I need to take the sword down from, over the fireplace and say that I'll throw in on this, though I have the many, hesitations and reservations that I'm constantly spouting out there. It's simply that my culture and the groups of peoples that are behind me, so to speak. It's strange with the Romans, they have the different parts of their house and they have the different spirits associated with their house. But the manes, the ones who are the dead, their dead ancestors, are always, there's no singular form of the noun. Manes is always plural. Lares, panates, you can have a lar, right? The spirits of the kitchen and the areas of the cooking. The penates, who are the spirits of the part of the house where what in the East would be called the harem, the private part of the house. You can have a singular version of that. But the manes are always plural. And so there is a collective ancestry that feeds in through your genetics. And I do recognize that, though as I said, I'm about as much of a mongrel as you can be and still be all Indo-European. My people are the ones who make room for the few. Now, it's often uneasy. It's often difficult. And with all human cultures, you find that, I think it's in Seven Samurai where the villagers who are, and of course that, as we talked about before, is based on a bunch of Western things. And then, of course, Seven Samurai got picked up as the Magnificent Seven. So it was really a Western story that went to Japan and then came back. But, in that story, which is very indicative, you've got the villagers who are in trouble. And only then do they go talk to the crazy old man who lives at the mill outside of town. Because them always push the strange ones out. The thing is that whenever crisis comes, suddenly they want to hear about it. Like, Winston Churchill, his mother was American. Old Randy Churchill, ended up with syphilis and was very much a fucking free spirit anyway. The Brits didn't know what to do with Winston Churchill. But then when trouble came, just like the villagers going out to the old man at the mill, they asked the strange ones to come back because they're like, shit, we need something. We need some fucking idea. And maybe it's the weird one that's going to come up with it.
Well, you and I might have gainful employment because of that coming up. I don't know. I'm not sure about Winston Churchill. I know there's some different ideas about him, but I understand the archetype or the architecture of what you're talking about.
Well, I wasn't getting into the whole business of whose side he was really on. It was more the general cultural theme.
I understand. I do just want to inject quickly that the very notion you're talking about, and I trust that you're aware of this, it's kind of like that old Zen saying where finding truth or searching for truth is like riding an ox. It's like searching for an ox while riding an ox. Everything you're saying, you can't get away from yourself. You can't get away from what's in you. Everything you're saying is quintessentially Western, is quintessentially European, and maybe even Western in the Western context of the United States. The cowboy on his ranch, independent, the Western genre of film, that is one iteration of, again, that Aryan Indo-European spirit. So we have to understand it's very much a catch-22, and this is why we need people like Duchesne articulating these things for us and reminding us of these things. It's a bit of a minefield. Our particular catch-22 is that because we are so individualistic and because we are so exploratory and went out into the world and conquered and explored, we're harder to pin down. That is the interesting thing about Faustian Western European peoples. That's what's baked into the cake. You could talk about that in terms of personality, but you could also even talk about that in terms of geography. Obviously, there are parts of Europe that begin to bleed into the Near East, or in Russia begins to bleed into Asia, and there's overlaps. It's very complex. We are hard to pin down, and we are headstrong. We don't want to be, not all of us, but there's that strand in us where we don't want to be told what to do. As you said, you have your plot of land, you're looking after it. I just conjured up the image of the American West and the cowboy. That is a very European kind of a thing.
Or so Icarus flying too high and the wax melting his wings apart, or Bellerophon on the Pegasus and the gods strike him down. The idea of a demigod, how for his pride and hubris, Hercules is struck down. Each of them wants to become a god, but somehow slips up. But the important part is trying. It's sort of like the cyclical, unending, never resolved nature of Ragnarok. Or if Ragnarok is resolved, it brings in the new sequence begins again. And in the end, all falls before, chaos and old night, the Fenris wolf that binds them. When you say we're hard to pin down, what immediately occurs to me is that that's just another way to say this rich, impossible to define potential. And that potential, as far as I see it, always manifests in the individual. Now, that is then shared and communicated, and it's communicated with language, which is a social tool. And it has to last, it has to be communicable to others in order to enter the canon of our knowledge, to go into the great conversation of our books. So I'm not saying that it's that the individual alone is the entirety of the story. It's absolutely not. And they will always be the few, but they have that role that they play to bring these new awarenesses in, and eventually they become digested, they become a part of the collective awareness, they enter culture, and with each of these incremental developments, the culture is raised, becomes stronger, has more potential, more possibility. So I definitely see that as well. Now the problem is we are coming up on our closing, and it seems rather than being able to get anywhere near answering a question, we've rather been, able to touch a few different areas and maybe just establish the question. And the question is, for me anyway, and I'll turn it over to you to close however you see fit. The question to me is how we can avoid the way in which individuality is overwhelmed in times of crisis by a massive collectivization, because I see it coming here. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying it's unwarranted, and even given that it's always uglier than you ever imagine, it still may very well be necessary and the only way out. But in the course of whatever upheaval is to come, for my part, my great focus is how can we protect this pearl in the center? Because as a cultural technology, if you imagine the individual as a tool of the culture, and that we consciously realized it, and we said, yeah, there are a lot of problems, the collective has its needs and desires, and the many will always be the many, the few will always be the few, but let's protect this thing. I mean, look at the title of the book. I haven't read it, but he talks about Faustian man. If you're bringing up Faust, then you're talking about the idea of a magician, which is a man who wishes to be like a god, who will eat the fruit of the forbidden tree, that will try to understand these secrets, and who typically is, approached by mobs who throw rocks at him until he stops moving. It's like the old, it's either Zen or Taoist statement, don't talk to well frogs about the ocean. They'll get upset. So how, in the midst of all this upheaval that's coming, and again, much of it necessary, apparently anyway, how can we focus on protecting that aspect so that it doesn't become, smashed under the oncoming waves of this social upheaval? That's where I want to, as we talked about in our previous conversation over at No White Guilt, that's where I want to, as Nietzsche says, place the question mark. In wrapping it up from your perspective, because yours is certainly not my individuals being as they are individuals, where would you place the question mark? What would your closing statement about all of this be?
I'm fine with where you put the question mark, and I've thought about that myself. I wonder if there are times, if it's an ebb and a flow, and there are times when we need more of those individuals and times when we need to collectivize more, especially as you were intimating when it comes to just out and out survival, which is what we may be staring at, the reality of what are we going to do just to survive. But it's pointed out that it was during or right after times of great upheaval and crisis that there were tremendous flourishes of creativity, like the Renaissance. So as simple as it sounds, I think that it's vital to keep re-educating ourselves or reminding each other of who we are. Again, everything you say about the individual, I feel that strongly in myself. We're Western men. We can't help it, right? we have
Sorry.
to understand this is the milieu out of which we are arising. And our particular people have a unique blend, I believe, from what I know, of contemplation and aggression, of contemplation and action. It's weaving those two things together. You mentioned the gods, and I know Duchesne talks about whether it's the Norse gods or the Greek gods. Something, again, that is more unique about the West and our heritage and what we know of ourselves from those old stories and what they can reveal about us is that developed more so than in other cultures, the mortal men were on par with the gods. It was not, again, this blind deference, I tremble and quake and bow before the gods. It was, we are consulting the gods. We are understanding the forces of the universe and nature, but also making our own choices within it. And there's an interplay between those two things. It's like surfing a wave. Obviously, the surfer is at the mercy of this tremendous force of nature, the wave, but is still exercising these little instinctual micro decisions as the surfer readjusts his body to stay on top, stay balanced on that surfboard and ride the wave. That's one of my favorite metaphors for understanding, trying to conceptualize, is there free will or is there destiny? To me, it's an interplay of the two things. And we have a particularly developed way in our past, in our heritage, in our traditions, in our stories of understanding ourselves as, when we're at our best, I think, is when we understand that fire, that drive, that exploratory urge within ourselves, but it's balanced, it's tempered with the humility of knowing there are still forces of nature. We can't be gods willy-nilly and just make things up. We're still functioning within a framework of natural law, of physics, of how everything works. When we arrive at the crucible of those two things, that is what I believe, a lot of the classical virtues about the moderation and temperance play into. So the more that we educate ourselves in this, the more that we share these ideas, I think that we'll be able to hopefully, I know this is ending on an optimistic note, but navigate what's going to be, I agree with you, a very, very challenging time as we have to undo a lot of the insanity that's ensued over the last decades, century, however you want to see it, and have led to this moment where some of our people are justifying their own destruction and demise, essentially. How do we not let that get out of hand? Well, we have to get back in touch with that very tenuous balancing act that I was just describing between that drive, that exploratory urge, and the humility of knowing we're still woven into natural law of the universe, and there's a certain awe and humility that comes with that. Will everyone be able to access that? Given what we said before, I don't believe so. I think it's going to take certain leaders to be examples for people to be able to do that. But we'll see. It may very well get messy. I don't disagree with you on that.
Well, let's see what happens with that word example. For those who look at the Latin roots of the word monster, monster simply means example, which is why the host was placed in a monstrance, so that the example of the Christ's flesh could be presented. Yes, let's hope our examples aren't monsters. But then again, there are some cases where apparently a monster is what's called for, and you can try to explain it over and over and over again to people. And you can point and point and point to all the evidence that you can gather for how ugly it's going to be if they don't just stop for a second and start listening. And the real problem is that if you can't think, you got to feel. And this might be a bit unpleasant for everyone to feel. Let us hope that it doesn't have to get too much worse before it gets better. For my part, I am very happy to speak with someone who's more on the right and more, I don't know that you're actually more on the right than I am. I think our focuses are just a bit different.
Yeah. I don't get too wrapped up in that kind of the labels and whatnot.
Yeah, and if you did, you probably would not be speaking to me, which I appreciate you doing. And hopefully, you can continue to hammer on things like cooperation and and not projecting too much, and recognizing that to a certain extent we're all in it together. And as a part of the ongoing conversation you mentioned that we're all going to have, I will just continue to hammer on the idea of individuality. And if indeed we reconnect with the roots of our culture, there's very little to fear, because I think it's all coded into just that.
Yep.
So thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me on this. Hopefully we can pick up this thread again and perhaps even find our way out of the labyrinth with it. But
I'd love to. Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Now, before we go, I just want to give you one opportunity to again tap the different ways that people can find you online. Maybe mention No White Guilt as well. Just go ahead and let people know where they can find you. I noticed that over on your YouTube channel, you're coming up on 1,000 subscribers, and I would love it if after this video you got to break that mark, because you've got great content, and I think folks should give your channel a chance, and hopefully we can see it grow a good bit more. So where can people find you?
I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to the snowballing of that, because it's been a number of months now, better part of a year. But yes, the easiest thing to remember for me is thegreatorder.com. Everything goes through that. If you want to find the social media I'm on, you go to thegreatorder.com. If you want to see an archive of the videos, although I do recommend you go to YouTube and like and share and subscribe as well. But there's other things on my site as well. There's a resource about the Euro-migrant crisis, a lot of testimonials and info and stories from news items. There's original poetry, there's some articles, there's curated art. I'm trying to show some examples of healthy contemporary art and some other things I'm going to be doing. So that's where it all comes together, is the actual website, thegreatorder.com. My YouTube channel is The Great Order. And as you just mentioned, I do regular live streams co-hosting with my friend Jason. His channel is No White Guilt.
Well, excellent. Then until next time, thank you all for watching. And Jared, thank you very much as well. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.